This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1075, a conversation with Chaz Gower.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1075. It's a conversation with Chaz Gower, who recently wrote a book called Stanley Lied. It's all about taking a look at the origins of Marvel Comics, the book that was originally published in the 70s and has recently been republished, and taking a look at the text that Stanley wrote to go with all the origin stories of Marvel Comics characters in that particular book, and where he lied. And not just embellishing, but there's actual outright lies that are in this text. And it's about going through the text and using that as a larger framework and analysis of the, pretty commonly held belief amongst a lot of people that Stanley didn't do everything he said he did. And this is trying to explain and look at what claims were actually made by Stanley himself and which ones were false. It's an interesting take. I did enjoy the book. I did find some things I wasn't quite aware of, or at least definitely recontextualized a few things, which was interesting. I did mention to Chaz in the interview itself that at times I felt the book was a little extra aggressive in terms of his language, and I think he would be the first to admit that that is true. The content is definitely interesting, but I think at times the aggressiveness of some of the text could come off as tough to read for some. But I do think it was very interesting, and I had a really good conversation with Chaz to talk about the book, what went into the book, and why he wrote the book. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Chaz. You can email me at at comicshenanigans@gmail.com. Rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. Thanks again for listening to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. Let's jump right into the conversation with Chaz. Enjoy. Chaz, welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I guess I should pull the curtain behind and say to people that you're actually recording on Christmas Eve. So I'm very much appreciative of you taking the time out of the holiday season to have a chat about your recent book.
Not a problem at all.
So for those who don't know, the book is called Stanley Lied, your handy guide to every lie on the origins of Marvel Comics. So we'll get into that in a second, but I feel like we got to go backwards and kind of understand your bona fides first as a comic book fan and then as a historian of note. So what was it that first made comic book or brought comic books into your life? What was it?
I was a kid, in the 70s, I guess about 10, 11, 12 years old when I started to really realize, I read Archie and occasionally a comic book, DC or Marvel or whatever, but I really started to kind of take notice to them about age of 10, 11, 12 years old, and just enjoyed it, the colorful experience of picking up the comics and the reading the stories and just getting into it, and it's a good memory for me still. I have copies of some of those early comics that I first picked up, and I just really loved it.
Mm-hmm. Was there a particular character that seemed to be the favorite, especially when you were younger, and has that persisted at all, or?
Well, the Amazing Spider-Man was my favorite character when I was younger. It's one that stuck around for a while, I guess. About around the 90s, it started to kind of wear thin for me a little bit. I really have no feeling or connection to the character at all now. Today's comic books are a little bit alien to me as far as the mainstream stuff. It just isn't. It's just not the same thing. So yeah, it's a little different now. But that certainly was the one that appealed to me at first, and the whole history of it. It's. Yeah, I know that character probably better than any other.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I always like to say that, as far as being a regular reader of comics, that the X-Men is what brought me in, but Spider-Man is what kept me in. Whereas, over the time, there's X-Men books all float in and out. I'm like, I don't know if this is really for me anymore. But for Spider-Man, even if at times the character, as you say, kind of feels very different, it still has been the character that has kept me in to some degree in terms of the regular kind of floppy monthly in and out.
Right. I'd say the thing that has kept me, like, one of the things that I like about comics, if I were to say what has kept me in the 90s, and this ties into everything with my book too, is that I began reading the Comics Journal and discovering a lot of different artists and writers that I didn't know, mainly independent people. And the creativity of that is really what kept me going with comics. I still followed the mainstream to some degree because I guess I just was geared towards it. But even now, I mean, I would just much rather pick up the newest work by Charles Burns, in a book format than to buy I can't even imagine buying a monthly floppy anymore. It just seems completely weird to me at this point. I understand the process as a way of keeping it going, but I don't know. It just does not hold the same allure at all.
Mm-hmm. When you were, first kind of getting into comics, do you remember the first artists or writers that you really kind of took note of? It's always interesting to find out who those are for people. It's one thing, you start with the characters, but eventually it becomes the creators to some degree. So I'm curious, what were the first ones you really started to take notice of?
It's funny because very, very early on, I did take notice of the creators. I mean, right from the very beginning. And I was spoiled because I was reading some of the Marvel magazines at the time were some of the first stuff that I had. And so reading, Barry Windsor Smith and Savage Sword of Conan and, some of the artists like that, completely ruined me for regular mainstream comics. But in mainstream comics, obviously with Spider-Man, I very much noticed John Romita right away, and he became a favorite. A lot of people will criticize my book and say that I'm just a Kirby lover, and that's what is making me, go after Stan Lee or whatever. And I do love Jack Kirby's work. And Kirby, I noticed, but I noticed his DC stuff first because that's when I began reading, was in 73, 74, 75. And so, but my very first, I mean, really the first couple of artists that I noticed were Romita, Jim Starlin on Captain Marvel, and then Warlock, became an artist that I followed, even now to this day, what they're doing, and Barry Windsor Smith and some of the artists like that. So, yeah, I noticed it right away, some of that stuff.
It's interesting when you are doing your book, and obviously we'll get more into focus on this in a bit, but when you're talking about people, obviously John Romita comes up in the book, and obviously he is supportive to a degree of the lies, so to speak. Does it change your view on, are you able to still appreciate the art, or does it start to change your view because of the other things going on?
It really doesn't. And I try to explain that to people because obviously people are very, very protective of Lee's legacy to them. And, well, that's incorrect. It's the people that really are very negative about this book. It's not about Stan Lee to them. It's about their memories of it. It's about their feelings on it. It really doesn't have anything to do with Lee at all, protecting him. They fight it because they have these fond memories from when they were a child of what it meant to them. And so that makes it very difficult to talk to them and to deal with that. And they're the ones who come at me the ugliest, with the negative blowback, and they're just angry about it because when I was a kid, not a kid, I mean, I guess I was 18 when it happened, when I was a Beatles fan as a kid, and John Lennon was shot and killed.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, it affected me or whatever, but not too long after that, Albert Goldman came out with a book about Lennon that said some really negative things about him. And I remember at the time just thinking, that's weird. It didn't affect me. I still felt about the music that I loved it. And I realized that human beings are, they're going to make mistakes. They're going to do things that aren't pretty. They're going to be who they are. But what Lennon did as far as his work, that's never going to change in my mind. And so I try to tell some of these people, look, none of this changes how you feel about Stan Lee. Feel how Stan Lee's work, love it, how it is. But, this is a lot of this is just facts that are there for us and can't be denied. So.
Why it's an interesting idea, right? That there's this kind of myth, and obviously he perpetuated it throughout his life, that he was the creator, and unfortunately, you see that every time you would ever see him described in the media, it was usually kind of basically piggybacking on that without really doing much deeper dive, and so you end up with this perception, which is very widely held, because he's the most visible Marvel creator that there ever was in terms of media, etc. Obviously by his own design. And so it's interesting, that people would not be able to let that go because it feels so part of the bedrock. So why do you think that is so difficult for people to let go? Is it really that familiar connection with this kind of Uncle Stan type of idea, and it's hard to reconcile that with someone doing something that is not really great?
It's a very good question, and then there are a couple of reasons I think that hold true with it. One is obviously the nostalgia that some people had. Comic book people, for those of us that were doing it in the 70s, and I'm sure this held true even more so in the 60s, it wasn't cool to be into comics. It just wasn't. And so a lot of times the people that were not popular. They were not cool. They were not, tons of friends around, etc. And Stan Lee did a job of really sort of hypnotizing them and putting this information out there. If you go through and you go back and you read some of that stuff, I mean, you can tell how he was using it to build an army of followers. I don't even know if he understood how he was doing it, but he was very clearly, telling them who they were, using phrases like culture lover and, telling them you're reading the greatest comics ever. To me, that turned me off, as a reader. Because, I would see on the cover of a Marvel comic book, this might be the greatest story that we've ever told, and blah, blah, blah. And I would get inside and I would not like the artist, and I would read the story and I would think that's really not a good story at all. And so for me, it was a big turnoff. But for a lot of people, I don't know, they just got caught up into the excitement of it. So number one is you have that nostalgia factor that people just fight it to keep that truth alive in their head. Secondly, is that as a sales thing, because the hobby is really geared so much now around sales completely. It was something that fueled the collector's sort of binge for, decades, is that thing of, those Marvel comics, those people believed the books were so much better, and thus they, continue to collect it even to this day. I as someone who has bought and sold comics for decades myself, I mean, there just were more Marvel fans out there. So that's one aspect of it. The second is the sales aspect of it. Mm-hmm. The people who sell comics, because even myself, and I bought and sold comics for decades, that collector mentality of the Marvel, Marvel's the best, Marvel's the best. The DC collectors, they were rabid, but they weren't as much out there. I guess they fell off a little bit, but they were there, But that sort of a collector's mentality was very beneficial to the comic book dealer, and so they don't want to see that lie go away because that's something that they were able to use. When you can say Stan Lee encompasses all of this, even after he was gone and had nothing to do with the Stan Lee presents, there were just so many angles to it that they could sell it by having that myth there. That's two very powerful forces there. Mm-hmm. Then when you take the Disney aspect of it, as a corporation owning, it's very easy for a corporation to say, and Disney's a perfect example of it. Walt Disney created all of this. Well, no, he really didn't, and we know that. Same as Stan Lee created all of this. It's very convenient for people to have one person there to be able to look at and say, oh, yeah, I know who that is. Because comic books, most people just don't take it as a serious thing. And so to know it and think they understand it, it's very easy to point at one person and say, Stan Lee, oh, yeah, he created all of that. And so it's an easy story to tell. So, yeah, there's a number of angles that are there for it that have helped to keep it in place like that as a belief that that's how it happened.
Now, when and how did you decide to write a book specifically refuting, stuff that he had written in Origins of the Marvel Comics? Obviously, we just had a new version of the Origins of Marvel Comics come out. Was this planned to come out at the same time, or had you been working on a project like this all along? What was the genesis of a project like this, and when did you start feeling this way that you needed to kind of express these types of thoughts on paper?
So, and this ties in what we were talking about before, as far as when I'd gotten disillusioned with comics, or began to get disillusioned in comics. I was reading the Comics Journal, and so this would be back in the 90s, and the Comics Journal did a Jack Kirby issue where they interviewed him. It's that infamous issue where he finally decides to really talk. Jack would say over the years, things in interviews, and I hadn't really read any of them at the time. That interview in the Comics Journal, that infamous interview, I remember reading that, and you can sort of. I understood the hyperbole of Stan Lee very early on without understanding that I understood it, in terms of listening to him talk and feeling like that there wasn't something sincere there. You know what I mean? I felt that lack of sincerity very early on, in the same flip way that when I read that Kirby interview, I felt not, most people look at that interview and they say they feel his anger. I read that interview and I felt his hurt. I mean, I could feel it in the way that he expressed it. He was hurt. Yes, he was lashing out, but it was from, a painful, source. And I think that's what a lot of people miss when they read that interview, but I picked up on it immediately. And so that influenced me very early on. And over the years, I followed it, and, in the days of CompuServe and different, forums, argued about it when I still didn't have as much information as is available now. Well, over the last number of years on Facebook, that Marvel Method group, I was, lucky enough to be accepted and brought into that. And I started meeting people and reading Michael Hill, whose books on Kirby, were hugely influential to me, and that I recommend to anybody interested in knowing more about it, especially Kirby at Marvel. That book is just lays it all out there. And so I began to think to myself, I want to write about this. This is something I would like to write about. And so I began to formulate. I began to start things, and nothing seemed right. And then that announcement was made about the origins of Marvel Comics, that 50th anniversary. And I thought, I cannot believe they are going to put this thing out. And that's when it just sort of dawned on me. It was like, of course, this is something no one has done in print. No one has written a book that basically stands up to Stan Lee and says, hey, bullshit, you are lying. And ultimately, for any of the flaws that people may find in the book or any of the little nitpicks that people have, and that's what Lee fans do, is they try to, nitpick little things here and there. For all of that, the basic thing that it comes down to is that Stan Lee lied. This book is one big lie, and I thought it would be a perfect companion piece to the release of this book. And so once I had that idea in my head, it became very easy to start and put together.
So it is interesting in terms of how you lay it out, because obviously, as you said, like you kind of follow along with the pattern of the book, but then you also have the extra essay chapters, et cetera, kind of fleshing things out that would have kind of derailed the actual kind of thorough line of going kind of bit by bit. How long had it been since you'd actually read the origins of Marvel Comics? And like, obviously you knew that there was a lot of falsehoods here, but had it been a while since you'd actually read it specifically with a more critical eye?
Yeah, it had been a little bit. I had tried to read that book. I really don't have a stomach for that writing, his style. And I don't know that anybody does now. I don't know how anybody reads. I know that they did the annotated version of that in their re-release where they talk about it, and I got blocked by that guy, Chris Ryall. Is that his name?
Chris Ryall.
Yeah. Because I asked him, I criticized his interview thing that he did where he was talking about it and basically, giving Lee a pass on it. And I criticized it a little bit and said, don't you think, what you're doing is, he was not happy and just kind of blocked me. And I understood why, I mean, when you're a fan and you're not, I mean, I don't understand it. I don't understand how somebody takes something that's such a blatant, falsehood and it would be like me writing a book about Milli Vanilli and saying, these guys were amazing. I know people were critical of them, but come on, they knew it was all a thing. No, it's not. And so the fact of the matter is, on the surface of this, I stood up to Stan Lee's lie in a way that really hadn't been done before. I don't know of any book that's out there that really has stood up to it and said, this is a bunch of bullshit.
The thing I did like about the book, I did the framing really worked really well. I will say that, because I thought, like, I remember seeing the title. I'm like, well, that's an incendiary title. It's it's blatant. You're definitely wearing it on the sleeve. Like, this is what this book is about. Like, don't be surprised by what this book is. But we're going to go through this. Yeah. And it was an interesting read because I did like the overall format of kind of going line by line and saying, no, this is what this proves this. There were times as a reader that I'm just being honest with you as someone, you wrote a book and I did like it overall. But at times I thought the language was harsher than maybe it needed to be, but also I understand why it's harsh, because he did a bad thing. And I think it's one of those things, as you say, it's hard to reconcile sometimes because we want to be able to understand that he did things that we don't like, but at the same time balancing it with, he was a flawed human being. He did things for reasons we can't also understand. What I really liked or thought was interesting in your book is how you talk about Two Morrows Publishing's Enough Said, which was something I really liked, how John Morrow had done kind of the counterpoint, looking at all the different writings over the years that Stan and Jack had been writing around the same time, so they could kind of put it in an order. And you seemed to indicate that you liked it, but also ultimately you were frustrated by the book because it didn't come down on actually having a stance. That it basically said, well, you can make your own decisions based on what this is instead of kind of making a definitive statement. So I guess that informs your own book. If that was something that bugged you about that book, it makes sense that you'd be like, no, this is how I feel. This is the decision I've made based on all the evidence I've seen. This isn't a wishy-washy answer. Stanley lied, and this is why. Is that fair?
That's extremely fair, and thank you for noticing that. And, except I would call it a stance that Morrow took, which is that, he got to the end of it and said, see, basically said, see, we don't really know, and it's like if you read stuff said, which to me, as much of a bone as I have to pick with that guy over his views and what he's done, it's a great source of it's a tremendous source of information. It's a tremendous source of information, and but at the same time, I can say the comics. The Overstreet Price Guide is a great resource book, but it's not necessarily correct in a lot of ways. And he's not necessarily correct. I think if you take all of the information in Stuff Said and read it and get to the end of it, and you're not just saying to yourself, yeah, there's something wrong here. Kirby, if you don't, then you're just kidding yourself. And so in the same way with my book, and believe me, there was talk through finishing this of even in my own head of, am I coming out at times and saying, showing my viewpoint on it, and maybe I shouldn't. And probably if I ever went back and re-edited the book, I would probably soften that aspect of it, honestly. But when people ask me about it, I say this. I say, in the spirit and memory of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, who really, I mean, that's really what it is the work that they did. They, in particular, as creators, were disrespected, more than disrespected. I mean, Lee stole credit and pay from the guys who really created the Marvel Universe. And to me, it's hard not to get angry as I go through that thing line by line and watch Lee just basically blatantly screw them. It's hard not to have those feelings and get angry about it, because I mean, realistically, without them, it never would have happened. It never, I often say, because people criticize, you never give Stan Lee credit. And I say it in the book, even I say, without Stan Lee, the Marvel Universe would not have been the same. Plain and simple as that. His hyperbole, his ballyhoo, whatever. But I don't care. I don't care about the success. What do I care how much money Marvel made? I don't care. It doesn't affect me. But the truth is that without Jack Kirby, it wouldn't have happened at all. And without Steve Ditko, it probably would not have been. Well, it wouldn't have been. I mean, what Ditko did just with Spider-Man. Spider-Man is the greatest character created since Batman, as far as just an amazing idea, that is long lasting. Spider-Man will be around for my entire life, and beyond, as an amazing, interesting character that's just everything came together with it as an interesting type of idea and character. And so those two men, I mean, to see them get robbed, to watch the whole process as it happens, in a sense, with the origins of Marvel Comics, yes, there were times I got angry, and I could not let my feelings just at the time doing it, especially, there were times I had to say something I felt, and yeah, so, but thank you for noticing that.
I did like that you brought up, I mean, one that makes sense to kind of bring up in this context now that there is more of a reevaluation over the last, couple decades about Stan Lee is the Bob Kane of it all. because you kind of say like, yeah, he stole something, but he felt contrition at the end and felt some sort of guilt that he wished that he had done something different. No, maybe he wouldn't actually, if he could have time traveled, he probably wouldn't have changed something necessarily, but at least he did kind of come out and say, yeah, I did him wrong. And that is something that Stan never did. And really wouldn't let go. And like you have stuff like the Jonathan Ross special where he keeps tiptoeing around being able to just say that Steve Ditko was co-creator of Spider-Man. He keeps saying, I will allow him to, I will consider it, but like not actually admitting to it. And I guess that's part of the broader point, is that if you've done wrong and someone is able to convince you that you did it, you should be able to at least admit it. And at some point in your life, say, I did something wrong. And I guess the book is really saying like, he never did that. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a big part of it. And I think that I understand where it comes from, because Lee, basically blackmailed Marvel into a lifelong contract of $1 million a year. I mean that's the basic agreement. There were more perks to that contract than just that. It was worth a lot more than $1 million a year. But he in a sense basically strong-armed them / blackmailed them into to doing that. And so in a sense he couldn't. I mean, he couldn't go against that. And I believe one of the and I think I put it in the book. I have this hope that in Reisman's book, the time that was spent talking to Larry Lieber, I'm hoping that there was a video recording made of Larry admitting all the truth, so that once he passes away, she can release that video and we can see, because Larry Lieber knows more than he's saying. He's just following his agreement with Marvel to the letter in telling us, what has to be put out there. And that's what Stan was doing too. Now, Stan had an ulterior motive to it, which was that it made him filthy rich and made him a celebrity, and he had cameos in the movies, etc. But basically, he couldn't go back and say, I'm sorry what I did to Jack, and I'm sorry. And I don't think Lee had that empathy anyway. I just don't believe that that's who he was. I think that I don't know, everything that I've read. I deal a little bit with the history of Lee in there, what the Golden Age people said about him. Stan was not this, happy-go-lucky guy that he presented himself at in the thing. He really was a kind of spoiled little brat who was used to getting his way and was a not your everyday guy, and he just I don't think he had that empathy in him. Kane showed that he did. Kane showed that he understood, and I showed some remorse. I just don't think that, even if things were different and it wasn't a contract in the way, I don't see Lee being the type of person to have said something like that in remorse.
One thing I did appreciate about one of the things you kind of lay out there is the fact that, he had 20 years before, the 60s to do something of note, and he didn't. And then he had years after that and also didn't. And it is hard not to look at that with a critical eye. It's one of those things where you don't really think about. You're like, oh, well, he wrote all those comics, but he wrote comics for a very specific period that did very well. And yet there was a lot of other stuff that he had done over the years that did not have anything. And how do you have that much of a hitbox in such a tight little period that happens to coincide with working with some of these men who are tremendously creative? And then, so it is one of those things where when you really start to think about it, you're like, well, that's weird that a creative person doesn't just become creative one day and then lose it. It's in them to some degree. And yet, as you kind of point out, he didn't really make anything of note both before and after this very specific period. And so when you really start to think about it that way, that does seem odd.
Yeah, and I think that, another one of my influences and heroes and all, I mean, I think that almost all of us in the Marvel method, and those of us who followed this, we look at Dr. Michael J. Masallo as the figure out there who has been able to say the things that he said and present the information about all of this and do it in such a classy way. I always say my book is like a atom bomb, that I throw out there, and I realize there's going to be. I just really wanted to just run up and punch that elephant in the room, like right in the face, with my book. And he's more of of someone who has done this. His Timely Atlas Comics blogspot is a must read for anybody that wants to understand that early Stan Lee. His in fact, when Stan Lee passed away, his writing on it, he goes through that whole period, and I don't see how anybody can read that. But the point I'm making with him is he says it's like comparative literature, where you're trying to look and see what someone wrote. Is you have to look at the other work that they do. And when you do it with Lee's body of work, pre-Silver Age and post, because, really, he just stopped writing. Creators don't stop creating. Kirby created right up until the day he died, But especially Lee's pre-Silver Age Marvel stuff, there's just nothing there that shows any kind of... there's just nothing there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's when you do a comparative type of thing, it's very, very glaring. Yeah.
A creator who obviously doesn't come out of the book looking much better, and I think in recent years some of their own things they've done has already kind of tarnished part of their image and their legacy. Is Roy Thomas. He doesn't survive this book very well. But it's interesting because there's obviously been more of a reckoning with him in more recent years, and whether or not it's him or people behind him, but trying to claim credit for Wolverine, etc. And it's easy to kind of see something like that and then read this book and be like, well, there's some dots to connect here about if he's seeing Stan do stuff as an editor, then it's not outside the realm of possibility that he would try eventually to do a similar thing after some of these key creators have passed away. How did you feel about how the vision of Roy kind of got changed or modified in the course of reading this and doing the research for the book to understand who Roy was and how he was used as a supporting pillar of the lie?
What a great observation. Like a lot of things, Kirby pointed it out to us way back in the day, with the funky Flash Man and the House Roy. He hit the nail right on the head back in 1972. So I think that he recognized it. Kirby recognized it right away, exactly who Roy Thomas was, and he was 100% right. And you look at Roy's career. It basically is coming in as Stan's right-hand man to lie for him and to do his work for him, and think in terms of, I'm going to take all this over someday. He really believed, I believe, that he was going to inherit all of that and be able to, make a name for himself that way. And of course, when Jim Shooter came in and kind of took away a lot of power from Roy, he left. And I love that Comics Journal interview with Roy Thomas, where he almost comes out and really tells some truths in that interview. And he waited another 20 years for Lee to come to him and say, Roy, you haven't been too bad. I can still use you. Here's what I need. And of course, create that propaganda, magazine to bring that back to life and use as a propaganda tool for Lee's legacy. And Roy he eventually has kind of gotten what he wanted, not quite the way he wanted it, but he certainly is considered to be a voice of fandom that tells it how it is, when realistically, I mean, Roy Thomas is a big liar. He's a big liar. And anybody that tries to, Michael Hill can attest to it, in trying to bring up this information and talk to him about it. And Roy basically shut that down, as called him names, and doesn't want to deal. Roy doesn't want to deal with facts. You know, we see now exactly. I could write a Roy Thomas lied book, you know.
Well, it does feel like things have changed, though. It's interesting because, like, I was never maybe super plugged into the Roy of it all. Obviously, I knew about the Funky Flashman and the House Roy, but you know, it's more. It's interesting in the last few years where suddenly I'm seeing more creators really coming out against him because of what's happened with the Wolverine situation. Like, it's interesting that, you know, how quickly one could try and tarnish their own legacy is really
you're 100% right about it. I know I could go back and find things that I wrote about Roy Thomas where I was like, you know, this guy was underrated for what he did, you know, in the 70s for blah blah blah. But realistically, no. When I really go back and go through it, and you're right, this has caused people to sort of, you know what Roy does not have that Lee did? Lee had personality. Lee understood exactly how to manipulate people. Lee was almost diabolical in his ability to glad hand people. He was really great at it. And Roy doesn't. Roy just really does not have that. And so it comes across as a money grab. It's so interesting to me to watch, as you say, these creators who are reevaluating how they feel about it, especially because of this Wolverine thing. It's so hypocritical. It's like, hey, Lee did this his entire life. You know, he screwed over creators, you know, by taking credit, you know, for creation of these characters. And, you know, here Roy Thomas does it. And people are like, oh, what does this guy think he's doing? Well, you're the same people that back off the Stan Lee argument, you know. And yeah, it's kind of hypocritical, but interesting, as you say, how it works.
Why do you think that is so different? Like, why do you think people are having such a visceral reaction to it? Is it because it's, I mean, this sounds so dumb to say out loud, but is it because it's happening we're watching it happen in front of us? Whereas the other thing is almost like it happened, but we weren't around to see it happen. And by the time we got to it, it was too late. Whereas we're seeing it happen.
Yeah, that's a little bit of it. Absolutely. That's a little bit of it for sure. And, but I also think that the lie of Lee is built so strong and has such strong I mean, think about it. Say you're, and I just pulled Eric Larson's name out. Larson certainly accepts a lot of things and is more pro Kirby, but and maybe he's the wrong person to pull out. But you pull out somebody like Jerry Conway, and I don't know how much of a stance either way he takes on it, but you know, he still gets residuals from Marvel. Marvel didn't call them residuals. I forgot what they call them, but you know, the wording of the contract is that you can't say anything bad about Marvel, and I think it even specifically states Stan Lee. And so what you have there is, you don't want to hurt your possibility of, you know, getting that money from Marvel, you know, that they pay you every time they do a reprint of your work or whatever. And I don't even know how much it is. It could be, you know, not great money, but just some money rolling in. But also just in the future of possibly being asked to come in and help with a movie, you know, or what. There's so many work possibilities that are there. You know, Paul Levitz, I tried to talk to him a little bit. I think I mentioned it a little bit in the book about the Kirby numbers. Supposedly he's actually seen them for the Fourth World books. And I tried to talk to him about it. He wanted nothing to do with it because Levitz is another guy. He's a guy who doesn't get as, you know, work from the industry, would like to be able to get work from the industry, doesn't want to burn any bridges because that Stan Lee bridge is a big one. And you say the wrong thing, especially today in social media or whatever, and it can come back to haunt you to where, I mean, Marvel is most likely never going to employ me as a writer, because the book doesn't, benefit them. It's something that makes them look, makes them look bad. And so I think a lot of those creators don't want to go down that path. I appreciate the ones that do, that aren't afraid of it. Mark Wade, another guy who's blocked me, we've had some arguments about it. He agrees, yes, Stan didn't do everything he said, but he doesn't like the idea that we talk about it on an endless basis and bring it up consistently and blah, blah, blah. But, that Marvel Method group is amazing. I don't know how much you've read of that, but that Facebook group, it is read by far more people than actually are able to contribute to it as a closed group. Let me just say that.
What was the general response to the book? Because you kind of mentioned like it's a polarizing thing because of this myth of Stan, because it is something that people were very protective about, either literally Disney because they're using it as their cash cow, so they want to protect it, and any claims of creator credit, etc. So it makes sense why they'd want to protect it. And then you have people who just have fond memories of growing up with 60s and 70s comics, or buying Origins of Marvel comics in the 70s, and this is their foray into comics, and so they hold that very close, and they remember the feeling of, as you said, like the Marvel was the upstart, so they were the ones kind of being like, oh, we have this cool clubhouse. We have all these creators. These are who they are, creating cult of personality that DC frankly didn't care. They were just putting out books. It was a little bit more work a day at the time, at least. So what has that overall reaction to the book been? Is it what you expected it to be? Has it sold better than you thought? What has your take been so far?
So,
you don't have to answer any of those questions if they're too personal.
No, not at all. The book has done well for me. I'm pleased at what I was able to do on my own. I'm still searching for a literary agent and a publisher. I would like to put this out on a much larger level. I think this book will outlive me as an important work, regardless of what anyone thinks the flaws are of it. I think that what I've done is I've stood up to Stan Lee, and nobody ever has done that. And so I hope that it is the atom bomb that makes it even easier for people like Michael J. Vasallo and Michael Hill and people to continue to give us information and put information out there. That I wasn't afraid to sacrifice, whatever credibility anybody wants to give me or not give me from, my personal viewpoints in it or whatever, to put that out there to blow it up and start the process of turning it around. And it has caused people who previously thought otherwise to stop and go, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, you're right. Something's not right here. And so the reaction to it from some people has been very positive, has been very, oh my God, the amount of quotes of the book and what they find. Some people within that group still take issue with the way that I come across, because man, I do come across like a sledgehammer throughout that book, constantly coming at it with more and more information. But that's because there's so much information out there. I could write a companion piece to this book, and there are other books coming. I mean, there is more information out there. But J.L. Mast, I don't know if you've heard about his book coming up.
No, I don't think so.
Which is now, I believe he's saying now 2026, which is a shame because I'm ready for it to come out now. Man, what he did was he went through those archives, the Stanley archives. He went to public records. He went through. I mean, he did research far beyond what anybody's done. I mean, it's amazing the information that he has. We're going to have a proof that Goodman was going to sell Marvel Comics. He was done with it after the implosion, which proves that Jack Kirby walking in that day is basically what saved the company. Jack walking in and say, hey, stop closing up. I'll put you out some books that'll help you sell. And it shows it. But not only that, he's got I mean, there's so much information that's in there. He's got actual what does he call it in there? The writing scripts to the book. He's got interviews that shows that Lee was using ghostwriters as early as in the 60s at Marvel. That a lot of those when the artists would bring in the work, and it would have to be scripted at that point, what he would call a script, from the artist's stories. Lee wasn't even necessarily doing that. He was using ghostwriters even then. And his book is going to really, really blow things up even more in terms of going after that false legacy of Lee in terms of who he was and what he actually did. So I love the idea that there are people that like the book, love the book, have changed their view, have increased their view. On the CGC forum, I had a guy, I had a couple of people who were diehard fans who read it, were interested because they saw the passion I had behind it and changed their view. And so I got a lot of good, and believe me, I hung on to that because the negative views that I got from it were just really ugly and really gross and really harsh. The people that hated this book were I had some people say some things and come after me, and it was I've got pretty thick skin, and so I was able to weather that. But there's not that many people who have gone through who there's not that many people that go through that level of having hate shoved in their face like that. It's a pretty strange feeling, believe me.
It is interesting because, I mean, as you said, though, it's less about you. It's more about having to confront something they don't want to confront, probably. Right? Like, yeah. I mean, I will agree at times you were a little harsh in the book, and you've already said you kind of agreed that at times you were, and maybe it could have been a little softer. I understand, though, because if the myth is so loud, you almost have to yell louder just to get over the sound of the lie. So I get it. It is an interesting book because it took a lot of stuff I already kind of knew, but definitely recontextualized some of it in a way I hadn't considered. Or, as you said, like you lay it out really well in terms of being able to kind of move, because you're able to go line by line. You're creating a really interesting kind of counterpoint narrative, and I did think that was very impactful, because instead of being more vague about it or just kind of saying, well, this is what Stanley has said in general, by going line by line, it allows you to be very specific about how you refute things, and it's harder to discount what you're saying when you're being that specific. So I thought you were laying it out quite well from an argument perspective to support your argument by being able to kind of go through a one by one.
Yeah, and I think one of the greatest arguments in the book doesn't even come from me. It comes from the artists who tell you. I mean, those artists told us over the years exactly the way it worked and exactly the way it didn't work. And I wanted to spotlight that and highlight that. And like I say, there are certain people that are never going to listen to it because in their minds, they just can't comprehend the idea. And for me, like I say, I just don't understand that thinking. Nothing has changed. Like I say, when I moved out of the country, I sold my whole collection. I just got rid of stuff, you know. And what I kept a stack of books that are very near and dear to me. And some of those are Marvel comics from the 70s, from the era that I'm talking about. It doesn't change my feeling for those books. You know, I grew up with those books. I loved them. There's still some stories in there. To me, you know, Superboy number 195 is still one of the greatest comics I've ever read in my life. You know, I'll always have that because I loved it as a kid. None of it changes what I loved. But I guess because Lee was such a strong force in some people's lives that it becomes a personal issue to them and they don't like it. But I don't know. I just never understood that mentality of holding on to a lie. I don't get it.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned before, and we kind of talked about it a bit, but you know, the idea that as an editor, like his job was to raise sales of Marvel books. Like that's what everything was about, was going to be, how do you make Marvel succeed? And that was the cult of personality. That was talking to the reader. And yes, it was sometimes hackneyed and silly language, but it connected and resonated with people. And that's how you created Marvel Zombies. That's how you created this ravenous group who are going to be diehard Marvel fans. And it's because of stuff that is in there. So I understand it's hard for them to kind of pull that apart for themselves because it's not just the books. It's like, well, the reason why I was a diehard Marvel fan was because of Stan Lee talking to me. And now I feel like I'm losing that. So I can understand that might be difficult because it's not just about enjoying the work. It's what that work meant to that person in their life at that time. And that's a tricky thing to unwrap and kind of pull apart.
And I think that it shows itself exactly, too, in the numbers that we have now, in exactly how that loud minority is able to frame the conversation. Excuse me. If you think about it, they did raise the numbers, but not really. I mean, if you think about it, you know, some of those books, yeah, they sold. Marvel none of their titles ever were the top sellers throughout the entire 60s. I mean, realistically, Spider-Man didn't take over the number one spot from Superman until like 1978. Lee was long gone from writing that book or writing it, but you know, he was long gone from having anything really to do with it. And it was Romita who was still playing like art director / overseeing that book, that it remained in a certain way, the way that everything was laid out. And but that belief is that Marvel exploded in the 60s and was, suddenly the biggest publisher that there was. And that's not the case. Realistically, I think Marvel ascended, one, because of the characters that Kirby and Ditko created, the visual impact of their work, followed by some artists that used Kirby's sensibilities to make themselves greater artists. To me, I think Romita, and man, some of my friends in the Marvel Method group will take issue with this, but I really do believe this. Romita, his work, for me, the reason I believe it resonated with me so much was that he was able to take that Kirby aesthetic and add it to his style, which had been structured from romance comics for 7 years before coming back to Marvel. So it gave it it separates him from Buscema, who was a phenomenal artist. I love John Buscema. Okay, but Romita had more of a warmth to his art because he had that grounding in romance, and so he encompasses, to me, like his work is in the 60s, to me, is some of the greatest comic book art ever done. He was not a writer like Kirby was a writer, but he wrote Spider-Man during that time, which he doesn't get credit for. I mean, he wrote that book during that time. But also his art, the strength of it. And to me, that's what sold Marvel. John Buscema came in and gave that beautiful artwork to the books. The color to it. If you look at the color on those covers, they're beautiful. They jump out at you with, especially with the blacks and the reds, the dark tint to it. It just had it had an explosive, colorful power to it that I think some of those DC books lacked. And all of that stuff was from people who were just good at what they do. And so that wasn't Stan. A lot of the things that made that powerful were there. What Stan did was Stan built an army of zombies. Mm-hmm. I don't know that he necessarily made those books more popular because of it. He made it more popular with the zombies, but realistically, Marvel didn't really truly explode as a publisher until the Jim Shooter years. That's when they really exploded as a publisher. If you think about what Marvel, the opportunities that they missed, I mean, think about it. What was the biggest comic book TV show in the 60s? As Marvel was supposedly the biggest TV show, was the Batman live action show, which is a cultural phenomenon. What was the big comic book movie in the 70s? It was Superman. What was the big comic book movie in the 80s? Well, in 1989, it was Batman, But Marvel, as a comic book publisher, started to really kind of blow past DC, really in the Shooter years. Marvel was on the brink of bankruptcy in 1978. After everything that Stan supposedly did, they were on the brink of bankruptcy again. Star Wars saved them, and that all happened accidentally too. They were set to turn that down. So realistically, what history shows us is that Marvel fumbled and stumbled, and once Kirby was gone, really couldn't maintain things. All of those books went down in publication numbers throughout the 70s. The whole business went down. Mm-hmm. Comics were not a big deal. It's weird to think that Todd McFarlane probably sold more comics than Stan Lee did with John Romita through that whole decade. That is
very, very weird to consider, but you're right.
So, yeah, the success of Marvel, I think, is a little bit overrated during that time in terms of Stan Lee doing it. But what Stan really did was he built himself an army of zombies to promote the idea that those were the greatest comics ever made. And I don't know. I read those Iron Man issues and those Ant-Man issues, and those were not some of the greatest comics ever made.
No.
Once Kirby was gone from the Fantastic Four, that was no longer the world's greatest comic. Lee wrote it for another year and a half, and it was really bad. It was really bad.
I will say one thing I also enjoyed about your book was the use of the different charts to show sales numbers and where the jumps were, which creative teams were working on there at a specific one, and kind of charting how there was movement or not in some cases. I thought was interesting. And again, putting all that data kind of together was an interesting snapshot, because that isn't something that is, I guess if you go looking for it, you can find it, but as generally available, you're not going to see a lot of that stuff. So being able to pull some of those facts and figures together, I thought was a really interesting resource as well.
Yeah, and I mean, they did face other problems. Certainly, as the cover prices went up. It factored into it. But I think that what it shows is that in the 70s, as those fanboy writers came in to try and take over and create their own little, Stan Lee, world where they could have artists do the work for them. You saw that. I mean, John Buscema, when you look at the work he did on Fantastic Four as an artist, it's phenomenal. I mean, I look at that stuff and I'm like, what a great artist. What a great comic book mainstream artist, But those books, they didn't succeed. And the reason they didn't succeed was because when Kirby did it, Kirby told a story. He knew how to tell a story. He knew how to create things. He knew how to, move things along. And I'm not talking down John Buscema at all, but John Buscema wasn't a writer, and he had to do more writing than he was used to. And so those fanboy writers that came in that disparaged Kirby's writing, they weren't able to save it. Fantastic Four went down for years. And who finally came in and to a degree saved it was John Byrne, who came in and finally took the numbers up because he was a writer-artist. And believe me, I got my issues with Byrne, but the numbers don't lie. When he came back to that book as a writer-artist, he took it, he brought it back up. He brought those numbers back up in a way that realistically nobody would ever do again. That book would never be, they would never reach the Kirby numbers again, ever, even during the 90s. They just wouldn't. And but Byrne brought him up to a level that I don't even think his level consistently has ever been matched since then. He had it in about the 250s up to about the 275s, whereas Kirby had it doing about 320,000 copies a month. So I don't think Byrne ever got it up into the 300,000s, if I'm remembering correctly. But that book had fallen to 175,000 copies a month, and people use the excuse, well, the whole industry was down. Well, a good writer artist who could tell a story and give it some humanity, he was able to come in and get it back up there. So it could still happen. The right person doing it. Walt Simonson came on to Thor and turned that book around and made it a big thing again. Frank Miller took over Daredevil, and when you bring in real writers, and I just don't know that those guys were really that great of writers. And I know, that's another thing that I'm another, sacred cow that I'm blasting and saying, some of those guys, Marv Wolfman, Roy Thomas, saying they weren't great writers because they weren't able to take those books, even with a great artist like George Perez and John Buscema, and make them as successful as John Byrne coming in as a writer-artist doing it, Frank Miller coming in as a writer-artist doing it, Walt Simonson coming in as a writer-artist doing it. The writing and the art combined are an important aspect of it. They were not able to do that in the 70s. So it's just the numbers don't lie.
No. Well, Chaz, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me about your book. It was my vacation reading back in November, so I appreciate you coming on vacation with me and giving me a bit of a history lesson. Again, as I said, it definitely helped reframe some of the stuff in my mind. I would say my journey on some of this stuff has been over the last decade or so, really kind of learning more about it and trying to be a bit more thoughtful about my interpretation of history as I've tried to learn more about it. So I definitely appreciated the book. As I said, a little harsh at times, but besides the medicine going down a little rough, I think it was still important medicine. So I very much appreciated the book, and I appreciate you coming on to talk about it.
Thank you for having me. Glad to talk about it. I still love talking about comics, so yeah, it was great. Thank you.
And I guess we'll have more books hopefully to look forward to in a couple of years, or sooner than that, I guess.
Hopefully next year I've got the next one along the way. I'm working on something else right. Well, I just did a Thailand travel guide, so maybe the next one is going to be a comic book. But we'll see. I've got a number of things planned, but certainly more comic book stuff for sure.
Okay, well, I'm excited to see more. So thanks again so much.
Yep. Thank you for having me.